So after verifying the initial setup is working fine, that is all major browsers are working fine, and we are able to execute basic code on our browser. Now the next thing that we gonna do is to perform some testing on the application. Let's say I navigate to gmail.com, and this is the very first page that I want to perform testing on. So let's say uh, in case if I talk about testing this login window manually, so what all test cases we're gonna write? We're gonna verify whether user is able to type in the email box, whether user is able to click on this button, this link, whether there is no spelling mistake, whether this image exists on a page, whether everything is as per specifications or not, right? This is what we generally do when once we perform manual test case, or like manual testing on an application, or we write manual test cases, and this is what we need to automate it as well, right? So at the time of automating these things, if I talk about these things, this text box, this link, this submit button, it could be even a single dot on this page. Anything that you see on this page is basically an element, and an element over the web is called as web element. Basically these are HTML elements. The UI part is basically designed in HTML, right? Selenium has nothing to do with the language of the website. The business logic could be written in Java, could be written in PHP, Ruby, Python, any language may have used while developing this web page, this website basically. But the UI layer is mostly designed in HTML, right? So all these buttons, these links, these like text boxes, every element on this page, every single element on this page must be having a HTML tag. And when we are working with these HTML elements through WebDriver, we first need to find these elements on the page. So finding the element is mandatory. Finding element as in if I talk about, let's say I want to type on this input box. So this input box must have got some HTML code. Now how I can get the HTML code? Either right click and say view page source. If you do view page source, you'll get the entire HTML code of this application. But it's very difficult to find this text box in this huge code, right? So every browser, they provide some internal functionality. If you right click on your element and say inspect, it will take you to the HTML part of that particular element. You're gonna see the HTML component over here. Now in the HTML component, we need not to worry about that whether we need to learn the entire HTML in order to work with Selenium. In order to work with Selenium, we just need to understand that this is basically a tag name. This div, this input, these are all tags. These are the attributes like type, class, JS name. Attribute could be anything. And then there are values assigned to these attributes. And these values could be anything, right? We just need to understand that every HTML like element has got a HTML tag, an attribute, and a value, right? It may happen that any element may not have an attribute, but tag should always be there, right? There could be a possibility that element can have one attribute, more than one attributes, right? Element could have ID, could have name. Some element may not have ID, may not have name. So these things varies like in element to element, and the way how developer has actually developed that element, what all components that he have used, right? But we need not to worry about the HTML part. Basically, we need to make sure about a few things which are called as locators. So locators are one of the important part in your automation, your WebDriver specifically, right? There are eight major locators which are provided by WebDriver. Basically, these are element locating techniques over the web, right? So we call them as locators. So locators are ID. You can find the element with the ID of that element. Then name, then CSS selector, then XPath, then class name, tag name, link text, and the partial link text. These are the 8 major ways through which you can locate this element uniquely on the page. So this is very important. Whenever you want to work with any element, whenever you are finding any locator of that element, that locator has to be unique. If it is not unique, then what WebDriver will gonna do, it will find the very first element. Let's say if I have provided ID of an element as ABC, there might be a chance that the second element has got the same ID, that is ABC. So if I'm trying to find the element with the ABC ID and I want to hit the second element, when you run it through WebDriver, it will gonna hit the first element. So you need to make sure locators are always unique, right? So these are some of the things which we will be talking about once we start automating an application. These locators will be very much clear to you, right? The most frequently used locators are XPath and CSS, right? These are very, very important, right? There are a lot of syntax used for generating XPath or CSS. There are some tools available which helps us in generating these locators. I have actually talked about detailed topic about XPath and CSS in very much in depth, right? If you look at just next section to the current section, then you will find a section that says XPath versus CSS locator. So I've covered these XPath and CSS in very much depth. I mean, once you go through it, you should be able to automate any element easily on the web, right? You should be able to handle all the dynamic elements, all the complex elements easily on the web, right? But before we try hitting all these things, we should try it one by one. Let's say if I talk about ID, and again, it doesn't, it's not mandatory that every element will gonna have ID. So at times the element may have ID at times element may not have ID. Like if I talk about this element has got an ID, that is identifier ID. So if I want to work with this element, I need to provide the ID as this. Now, out of these 8 locators, I can provide any of them, right? I can even provide name. If name is there, let's see name is there or not. Yes, name is there. Name is identifier. CSS and XPath, these are 2 locators that you need to form, right? I mean, you need to create some syntax in order to generate these locators. So CSS for this element would be something like this. Now, how this is being formed, we're going to have a detailed discussion around it, right? Right now, don't worry about it. So there are some syntax for XPath as well. Let's say for this element, the XPath is something like this. Class name, let's say if element has got class name, yes, class name is there. Tag name is their input, but input may not be a unique tag because there are other elements on the page may have the input tag. Like you can see div, there are many elements with div tag. So input is a very common tag. So other text boxes, if there are more text boxes or more elements, they may have input tag with them, right? So again, till the time the element is not unique, the locator is not unique, you'll not be able to work with that element, right? So link text and partial link text is not relevant to the element that we are handling. If we are handling this link forward email, then we can give the link text as forward email, and in partial link text we just need to give the partial text, let's say forward. That's it. So these are some of the locators which will actually going to help you in identifying unique elements on the web. So based on the HTML property of that element, you actually need to find these locators, right? So let's try to hit the very first element where we got the ID as identifier ID. Now, as I said, when we navigate to seleniumhq.org and when we looked at the Java document, just give me a moment. So on the main website of Selenium, if I go to download, and over here, if I navigate to the Java document, so the very first point of contact should be your WebDriver interface. So if I go down and take you to the WebDriver interface, give me a moment. Yep. So over here, we need to go to the method summary to look what all methods available methods are there, and we need to look for a method which will help us in finding an element. So you can see the second method over here, find element. So what it does is that it finds the first web element using the given method. So as I said, the first web element means your first web element in the hierarchy in your HTML DOM, right? So this is what your HTML DOM component is. So the very first element, if you have given find the element with the ID of that element, the ID should be like with the first element. It should actually find the first element which contains that ID in this hierarchy, right? So now how are we going to find this element? Let's say I'm going to create a new class for it. So I'll right click on this package, say new class test. Okay, I'll name it as test finding elements. And then I'm going to add a main method over here. So as we know, to get started, we need to have this, let's say we are starting on Chrome. So WebDriver manager, Chrome driver.setup, and then WebDriver equal to new Chrome driver, right? So now I need to navigate to a website that is driver.get and the URL http gmail.com. Now after navigating to gmail.com, I need to find this element where the ID is identifier ID. So what I'll do, I'm going to call the method driver.find element, right? Now I'm getting something like by over here. So by, what this by is, let's look over here. This is by. So if you click on this, then this is basically a class, right? By is another class in WebDriver. And if you go down over here to the method summary, this is the method summary, you'll see there's a method called as class name, CSS selector. And if you look at our locators, class name, CSS selector are locators. And these are available in a form of methods. Similarly, ID, link text, name, partial link text, tag name, XPath. So all the methods, all the locators are basically available in a form of a method inside this by class. And all these methods are static in nature. Static means we can directly access these methods without creating the object of by class. So if in case I want to call this ID which accepts the string value, so what I need to do, I simply need to go over here and say by.id. I need not to create an object of by class. And this is a string argument. So in string, I can provide the ID of an element. This was the ID of an element, right? So if we were looking at the ID, so this is the ID of an element. So I'll just copy this and paste it over here, and that's it. This is how we found the very first element on the page. Now, after finding this element, what do we need to do with this element? We can store this element as well. I can name this element as username equal to this. Now, what will be the type in which I'll be storing it? See, when we have written driver.getTitle, we have stored it into string, like string title equal to this. Why? Because if you mouse over onto getTitle, the return type is string. And then whenever you want to do whatever that you want to do with the title, you want to find the length of the title, that method is provided by the string class. So when you say title dot, you get list of all the methods from the string class. Same way, when we are storing this element, we cannot store it inside string, right? Because whosoever developer has created this find element method must have defined a return type. So it is saying that change the type of username to web element. Now I'll click on this and this will be changed to web element. Now what is web element? String is a class, and what is web element? If you look over here in the Java document, you'll find that if I go back, see get title, the return type is string. So we have stored it inside string. But if you talk about find element, the return type is web element. Now, if you click on web element, you will see that this is an interface. So web element is basically an interface. So anything that you want to do with the web element like input box, you want to click on it, you want to type on it, you want to get the text, you want to do any feasible thing with that web element, the method is present inside web element interface. So if you go down over here, you will see a method summary. And what do you want to do? You want to clear the text, you want to click, or you want to type. For typing, the method is send keys, right? So if in case you want to type in this element, you will say username dot, and you get access to all the methods inside this web element interface. And one of the method is send keys, where you'll be entering your mail ID, like mine is trainer@way2automation.com. That's it. Just save it, run it, and let's see if it hits the very first element and type the email ID or not. See, navigated to Gmail and see, typed the email ID, right? So this is how we found the very first element on the page. And then we have used one of the locator called as ID, and through that ID we are able to type in this element. Now instead of ID, I can use name as well, right? So the next locator we have seen name, and this identifier was the name. So what I can do, I'll simply say name equal to identifier. Save this and run this, because name is also a method of by class. And see, it typed with that name as well. Similarly, apart from name, I can use CSS selector as well. So this is CSS selector. Instead of name, say dot CSS selector. Run. Right? And now you can try using XPath as well. XPath is this. Right, so you can give it a try with all 8 locators, and which one you are comfortable with, you should be using that. But the first focus should always be on ID, right? ID is the fastest one. ID, then name, then CSS, and then XPath, and then other locators, right? So we have successfully found the very first element with the XPath and with other locators, and now we are able to type on that element as well. Now, after typing in that element, what I want to do is, once we are successful in typing, let's say I write an email ID over here. Sorry, after typing, I need to click on the next button. So next button, again, this is inspect element. Just click on this, take it to the next button, right? Now from here, like the way we found ID, this element does not have any ID. There is one class. I can use the class name as well. Or I can use XPath as well, but how are we going to form up XPath? So we're going to learn all those syntax as well, but there is a way. Just right click on this element, say copy XPath. You'll get the XPath of that element. It's very simple. You need not to be dependent on any tool, right? There are some tools and extensions available for your browser. Initially, there was Firebug and Firepath, right? Which, like, when we used to work with Firebug and Firepath, it actually makes our life very easy, right? In locating these elements on a page. We, should be able to create complex XPaths and validate it with the help of those plugins or tools. But unfortunately, those were add-ons to Mozilla, like Firefox only, And this time, as of today, those plugins no more exist in the market. Right, the repository, they have been removed from the Mozilla repository itself. So you'll not be able to use that plugin. But yes, there are still other plugins as well, something called as CrowPath. I've talked about that CrowPath as well in detailed section of XPath versus CSS. So you can try configuring that thing as well. But again, I would suggest you not to be dependent on any tool, because your internal browser will going to help you in doing all those things, and we'll be learning about all those techniques in depth, right? So for this element, if I right click over here, I'll get copy XPath. I can get the XPath of this element, and what I want to do, I want to click on this element. So first we will be finding the element. We'll say driver dot find element by dot XPath, and this is the XPath that we got. Right, so this is my second element. I'm going to store it web element next button equal to this, and then I'll say next button dot click. So save this and run this, and let's see if we are able to click on that element or not. So go on to Gmail, type, and then clicked. So it successfully clicked on that element, right? Now the other way of doing these things, instead of storing it again and again into web element, what I can do it in this way as well. I can simply write driver.find element by .xpath for this element and say .send keys. Right, I can directly do send keys. Same way, I can straightforwardly click on this element without storing it. Sorry. Say dot click. And if I run this will gonna work absolutely fine. See? So what is the relevance of storing it and how this thing is being formed? What is this? Now before we jump onto this thing, you remember we have written string title equal to this, right? In the previous lecture as well, we have called this method title.length, and length is coming from string class. So what happens when we do driver.getTitle? Instead of writing it like this, I can also, instead of storing it, I can also print the title straightforwardly, as in print the title or manipulate the string or get the length of that string. I can simply say driver.getTitle. GetTitle returns me string. So whatever it returns me, if I put a dot after this, I'll get all the methods of string class. So I can simply say length. So driver.getTitle.length. If I print this will gonna print the length of the title. And same thing I did it over here. As in, instead of storing it into a web element, when I say driver.find element returns me web element. And if I put a dot over here, I should be able to access all the methods from the web element interface, right? So instead of storing it, I can straightforwardly use it as well. So 90% of the times we'll be doing it in this way. Driver.find element, first find the element by some locator, provide that locator, and then do click, send keys, or whatever feasible actions are there, right? But there is a very important relevance of storing an element as well, right? Through this way, we can manipulate the element later on. So what the importance of web element is, we're going to look at it in the upcoming section, right? So in this section, what we have seen, how to find the element with different locator techniques and how to click and type on an element. Now in the next lecture, we're going to look up at what all challenges we may face when working with these straightforward elements, and what all the troubleshooting that we need to follow if we face any challenges while locating these elements on a web. Right, so next section is a very, very important section. Right, we'll be doing a lot of troubleshooting, and we'll be discussing a lot about something called as synchronization, some wait techniques, right? So let's meet in the next section. All right, thank you.